Knowing that saying no is actually like the most valuable thing, and like your time is your most valuable resource. It's something I always forget, and I take it for granted when I don't until I don't have enough of it. But your time is space for you to recover. It is time for you to actually be able to think creatively.
Kia ora everyone, joining me today is Nathan Joe. Nathan is a New Zealand playwright and performance poet and is the current creative director at Auckland Pride. A graduate of the New Zealand Broadcasting School, Nathan's won numerous awards and has held a number of writer and residence positions. Currently, he is the editor of Elle magazine. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nathan. You seem to keep yourself very busy. What's keeping you inspired at the moment?
What's keeping me inspired is, I think, always this point in the horizon where I kind of fix a goal. And sometimes that's usually around the notion of growth or a large scale of work or maybe an intimate scale of work. But really, the only thing that I think can keep me going is knowing that there is something kind of across a few miles away that I can kind of fix my eyes on or fix my, I suppose, like determination on, because otherwise I feel like I get a bit wayward and unfocused. But knowing there is something there that I can kind of work towards is very gives me a sense of purpose. And I think that's a lot of the time when the sector can feel quite unstable, the work itself can be quite like a reassuring thing. Whether that's like a play or a project or a collaboration or the notion of returning to study or something like that.
So you sort of always have to have something that you're looking towards while you're working on something else?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if it's not something else, then the thing that I'm working on, I think, has to have a sense of breadth and scale and progression in mind. It's very rare that, unless I'm in like a really gigantic project, that I don't think about anything else. And I think that's very rare as well, to be in a project that really ticks all the boxes. Often we're hustling, trying to go from one thing to the next. I think the last time I felt like I could be fully present in a work was probably like a couple of years ago with scenes from A Yellow Peril. And that's because, I was also acting in it and performing in it. I think that's a slightly different mode. But when I'm making work, I think there are lots of pots on the boil.
And is there something in specific that you're working on at the moment?
The larger goal in mind at the moment for myself is actually to try and do grad school in the States, actually. So that's something I'm trying to work towards this year, and hopefully if I get into a program, it would happen next year. So that's quite a big deal, because in many ways I'm trying to do grad school to, one, become a more creative person and to be more connected with my creative self, but also to buy myself time as a writer, because often I think a lot of writers I know in Aotearoa, they're juggling a lot of other things, so that's never their like fixed focus. And I want it to be my fixed focus for a few years.
And so you've studied at broadcasting school in New Zealand. What would you study over there in the States?
I would look into studying specifically postgraduate studies in theatre, probably playwriting. I think there is something to be said of like deepening one's practice. The bar or the ceiling for growth in New Zealand, it's not that it's low, but the way in which you can kind of move from an emerging artist into a mid-career and into established can happen quite quickly and rapidly. And it can happen before you feel like you've actually grown enough to reach that point. No, that's how I feel anyway, is that I feel like I've managed to somehow very quickly in the last few years end up in these sort of leadership roles. And I shouldn't air quote that because they are leadership roles, but it can feel a bit, it can give one like imposter syndrome, but also one can feel a bit out of one's depth in terms of being in those roles before one has accumulated the knowledge and skills and systems to actually to honor one's own practice before they do that. So yeah, I feel like there's a lot of work that I skipped that I want to get back to in terms of my own writing.
And so you wear a number of different hats and all the different roles that you do. Tell us a little bit about some of those different roles that make up your work.
In terms of what has made up most of my like day job, full-time work in the last couple of years, I've worked part-time at the basement as a programming assistant or programming coordinator um, for around 2022, and then moved from that to Auckland Pride as their creative director. Um, what that involved a lot of the time was, again, more of a development in terms of programming and curatorial. So very much serving the artists in my community and ensuring that I suppose there are pathways for them to develop work and to present work. In some ways, like trying to do what was most beneficial to me as an artist when I was sort of coming through, and give that back. So yeah, curatorial programming, different from writing, very different from writing, and much more in the kind of arts administration side. There's a lot of like contracting out and like organizing artists and figuring out what they need. A lot of meetings, but and then kind of like partnering them with venues and leading up to like the festival, the Pride Festival. Yeah, which has been really beneficial, seeing how like the sausage gets made, so to speak. And I think there is like really high value in that, for an artist to understand both sides from like a creative and producing lens.
So are you quite an organised person? Because it sounds like you've got a lot going on there, all at once when you're in these different projects. Are you someone who keeps across things in quite an organised manner?
um, I'm efficient, but I wouldn't say I'm organized. So I think I make up for maybe my lack of organization through maybe the velocity or the hyper focus that I can get into. Like I can get into very good creative flow and creative projects and with kind of this admin work if I'm in the zone. And if it's the central thing I'm doing, I can really like power through it and power through it with quite a strong sense of like a strong sense of determination and passion. But I would say my inclination as a person isn't particularly organized. I kind of have to fool myself into it. And I think, there's nothing like a really hearty to-do list that you treat almost like a game to get through. But you kind of, for me, I kind of have to trick myself into that. I have to like do the to-do list and like make my way down it very like efficiently, very quickly. Otherwise, I get distracted.
Have you got other tools that you use as well as a to-do list?
Um, when I was first starting as an administrator, like my Google Calendar was sort of like king and my God. The issue now has been it's so messy and chaotic and full that it's sort of I've gotten too used to it now, and I almost start to ignore it. So it's strange the way in which we have to kind of keep refreshing that tools. That's something I found. Um, I think if I get too used to one tool, sometimes I get a bit numb to it, and it becomes the baseline. It becomes like oxygen or air. So, but genuinely speaking, like if I didn't have Google Calendar, I wouldn't know how to track my meetings. I don't know how anyone would outside of that.
Is that something that you try to keep sort of educating yourself on, like new digital tools that come along that can help creatives?
When I first started off, there was definitely like a period of experimentation, and some of them just don't work for me. Some of them I find like you put in almost more work to maintain them, and I think when it feels like that, I start to kind of fall off of it. But I think the simplicity of some of them, like a really good note-taking app, a really good calendar app, actually like a good voice memo app for taking meeting notes can be really useful as well. Like my voice recorder on my phone does transcribe them, and that's really efficient for like double checking things, especially if you can't minute everything in every meeting. That's quite impossible. But sometimes you're like, oh, I don't know, I can't remember what the exact detail of that was said. Is pretty useful.
So you basically work as a freelancer a lot of the time?
In the recent couple of years, Pride's really been my full-time job with freelancing on top of that, and that's where a lot of the, I guess, the work-life balance has been quite porous, to put it lightly. Like, there's no real differentiation between like work and life, and I found that difficult. But prior to that, it was predominantly as a freelancer, and when I wrap up my time at Pride, that will be the case as well, because as I sort of work towards this study next year, that will be a major thing. It's sort of like building a body of work to apply with, to like reapply to grad school with. And like freelancing, it does serve that a lot better than working as an arts administrator.
Have you found ways to balance that juggle, of trying not to, work to all the hours of the day and trying to keep a bit of balance in life?
With having a full-time job, honestly, the main thing I've learned is if you don't say no to extra work, you won't free yourself up in the evenings and in your weekends to actually recover. Like those full-time arts jobs, I think we want to have our cake and eat them too slightly. Like we want to be able to do them and then also maintain our freelance work. But most often that balance isn't very tenable or not sustainable. So knowing that saying no is actually like the most valuable thing, and like your time is your most valuable resource. It's something I always forget, and I take it for granted until I don't have enough of it. But your time is space for you to recover. It's time for you to actually be able to think creatively. So when you're doing a day job and a million other maybe seemingly small jobs, they accumulate to the equivalent of like a major project you could be thinking about.
It is really hard as a freelancer to say no, isn't it? When you're trying to make a living out of it, and and you don't know when the next job's going to come along.
Yeah, I think that's that's always a learning curve as well, and one that I'm still grappling with, is because you go from, as a freelancer, I think having not enough work, then not being able to say no to anything, and that balance, that sweet spot, is something you kind of have to learn through and work around. Yeah.
What sort of advice would you give to people who are hoping to embark on a creative life or are already on that journey?
I mean, everyone knows it's really hard, and it's really hard right now. I think remembering why you were doing it is really the main thing. I think one can get really bitter and anxious in this sector, in a creative sector, when one isn't able to kind of like maintain a sense of love for the thing. And love for the thing is about being selective about the projects you do, and about reminding yourself by doing maybe the right projects that actually there is a reason you've done this that is beyond the career aspect of it. If you're doing it specifically as a career, that's a lot more complicated, because really then your goal in mind is this kind of a very elusive notion of success, or the most well-paid job. And in some ways that's actually easier to measure in some respects, but I think existentially it won't ground you. And I think like reminding myself why I love it has always been the way. Alternative to that, I think actually like surrounding yourself with a cohort or peers who are going through the same thing, like having a sort of like gang, or a sort of tribe to lean onto, and actually like bounce and do sanity checks with, is such an important way to recalibrate amidst everything. I think that's really underrated, actually, and because it can be a really lonely practice. The notion of having a tribe is definitely something I don't think I would have gotten as far as I have without it, and maintaining those relationships amidst the busyness as well.
Yeah, is that something that is almost part of your work, is keeping those relationships alive and being inspired by those that are around you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is a kind of community aspect to it that needs to be kind of acknowledged, and that artists don't operate and work or create work in on an island. Like they actually have to be in communion with each other. With that said, if you don't honor those relationships, like you will lose them. And if you lose those relationships, actually, that's when that kind of resentment and bitterness, I think, comes along. And so much of a creative practice is staving off, or so much of a artistic practice is actually about trying to avoid bitterness. As much as it is about earning an income, it's also about not burning out emotionally.
Yeah. So, what are your personal productivity systems, and how do you avoid procrastination and personal blocks?
I think creating, whether they're real deadlines or arbitrary ones, has probably been the most beneficial thing for me. And obviously, a deadline to yourself, sometimes you will not listen to that. So I think the deadline has to be beholden to like other parties. So for instance, let's say you have a play you're working on, creating a deadline in which you have organized a group of friends to come over and read that with you as actors or whatever, is such a, such an accountability tool. So it's almost like less about productivity and more about accountability for me anyway. Because in a gentle way, like shame is a powerful kind of motivator, and it does keep you on track to ensure that you don't embarrass yourself. And you don't create like super high stakes with these things, or unless that's what you need. But you can create kind of low stake environments in which you've got like deadlines and containers which you have to be accountable for. Like that's not actually that difficult. All it requires is communicating to a mentor, a friend, a peer, or mentor, friends, peers, plural, and being able to have people you trust who can keep you accountable in that way. But again, doing things alone, that's when procrastination sort of eats at you, because it kind of creates a cycle of like, oh, I couldn't do it, so I'm not very good, and oh well, at least no one knows, so I don't have to tell anyone, and then progress isn't made.
You said before it can be quite a insular kind of a world when you're embarking on something creative, because you're sort of working by yourself a lot. Is it important to have, someone that you do look up to, like you said, like a mentor who you can go to for a bit of advice or just to have a chat?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think for a lot of the emerging creatives that not having a mentor, not having a mentor doesn't really serve you, even if it's someone you disagree with, because, and I think that's really important to acknowledge, right? Sometimes you will have mentors or leaders in your life that you don't agree with, but having someone to bounce off of and having someone who can question you is quite invaluable in terms of like getting you outside of your head.
Yeah. And have you ever come up against setbacks? And if so, how have you dealt with them?
Well, I reached a point when juggling sort of like my contracting day job, my part-time day job, and a creative practice. And this was, I think, in like 2018, where I couldn't quite figure out the balance. And in some ways, I wasn't getting enough of the contracting work that I wanted. So I was kind of reliant on bulking up my other hours with contracting work I didn't like or that wasn't creative. And I felt I was in a rut, like I wasn't making any progress because of that. I sort of was just like not making enough money to thrive as a person, but also not making a lot of creative headway. So that was tough, and I think that was tough because it's that feeling of not making progress and thinking that maybe you will never make progress. Um, Ultimately, I had to kind of break out of whatever routine I was doing. Um, And actually, I moved back home to Christchurch for about a year or two, about 2 years, to kind of get a bit of perspective and actually having the space to ask myself those questions, which were around, what do I really want to be doing with my time? Is this something I can live without? The creative practice, that is, and playwriting and theatre. Am I willing to leave the sector, and do I just need space? All these things that did definitely culminate in quite like a emotionally tumultuous time, but ultimately meant that when I returned to the kind of like a creative industries perspective, or a creative industries sort of goal, I did it with a lot more determination, and in some ways, I made peace with myself. I made peace with my decision to do it. Whereas I think when it's hard and you don't have enough time to think about why you're doing it, you ask yourself, should I even be doing this? And it can feel very unglamorous as well in those moments. But actually having a time to like a big thing I also have is like you don't have to always be doing it full time all the time to be considered a creative as well. You can actually leave the creative industries and go into another industry and come back if you need to, or leave the creative practice and do something that might build your skills up as a worker or as a thinker or as a producer who's less in the arts side of thing or less on the hands-on side of things, right? There are things that are adjacent to arts practice that are really useful skills that can actually like feed you in other ways. But knowing that quitting or isn't really like that's not really a real thing, unless you want to quit for good, I suppose. But you don't have to leave something for good. You can always come back to it. It can be too much, and taking care of yourself is actually the most useful thing if you want to do it in the long term.
Yeah, I imagine that's the same in most industries, isn't it?
Yeah.
What is your when you're in or out of work or working on something or working full-time or part-time, does your day always look the same? Are you quite structured or do you just go with the flow and when the creativity hits, you go with it?
You can't really just. I mean, so much of the creative practice isn't just the creative stuff. It's like applying for funding, and that's not the most pleasant thing to hear. But really, if you're not making work, you should be creating like documents and ideas for work and looking for funding for potential work. Like in a way, you're not just looking for someone to tap you on the shoulder. You're creating work for yourself in the future. And that's what I was kind of meaning when I was saying before that I'm often thinking about the next thing as well, because you kind of have to live in both the present and the future. Because if you're purely freelance, once your project is over, if you don't have anything lined up, then you're just working on a creative project and not getting paid for it, really. So the value of like learning to do funding apps is high. You get better at them, and actually, to some extent, having to answer those questions helps you sharpen how you talk about your work and how you think about your work. Not always for the best, but usually it's beneficial as a kind of iterative drafting process because, in a sense, you have to break it down and explain yourself. It can feel very like unmysterious and unsexy, but funding is important to pursue as like a second limb to your creative practice. Yeah.
Is it a matter of when you do apply for things like that, is it a matter of just giving it a go, or is there advice out there on how you can do it, or?
This is where that kind of mentorship thing comes in handy. It's valuable to talk to someone who's gotten funding successfully. Being able to kind of look at how someone frames their applications is so good. Understanding how other people talk about their work in a sort of funding ecology also is really useful. Because it's another language that one has to learn. Giving it a go is great. Like, definitely give it a go, but don't kind of, I guess, do that indefinitely in the dark, because obviously there is a limitation to like not knowing how to do a thing and not learning and not educating yourself and not getting that expertise and not being shy about having meetings with CNZ or whichever funding body that you're going for, but most likely CNZ, and asking for help, because I think one can get also very self-conscious about being new to something and bad at something, both from like a creative practice lens as well as a funding lens. These things are quite tricky, and so much of the time you're just ripping off the Band-Aid so you don't feel uncomfortable doing them for the first time.
It's so much really good information there, Nathan. That's amazing, because it's the type of thing that people often don't hear about, and it's nice to hear someone like you talk about it. We've just got a few quick Q&A questions just to finish with, just quick answers type thing. So what planning do you do, and who helps you stay on track?
What planning do I do? I'll usually have kind of like the three, I suppose, major poles would be like looking at getting the funding, looking at the creative process that's involved, and then developing the work, and then presentation. Like those are kind of like the three major ones. It's like funding, development, presentation, and then there's like the timelines that exist in each of those things. But really, you should be thinking about work in those three kind of stages at the very least. If you're not thinking about it in that way, you're kind of not thinking about it in its full scope. And that's not to say each one has to be very sophisticated or complicated, because you might realize that you can't get much funding for it, or there isn't much funding for this particular project out there. But you should be thinking in those three kind of steps at the very least. And then in some ways, there's also the fourth step of like getting it out there, like dissemination and publicity and marketing. But I know that can be quite a complicated additional thing to think about. But really, breaking down your project into chunks is the most useful thing you can do, and actually timelining it and stuff like that. I'm not the best at timelining unless I'm doing a funding app. So this is where sometimes funding does become useful, because you have to delineate and break things down for them, and actually that ends up being good for yourself. Building a budget does come into that as well. That's something I've come into quite late in the game, but being able to kind of break down your time, and again, you're required to do that for funding as well. But breaking down your time, and even if you are doing it in kind, understanding the value of your time and how much time you've spent on a thing is so useful. So when someone asks you for your rate and things like that, you actually have something to respond with. And also how much you need to survive and how much work you can do before you've used up all your hours doing in-kind work. But yeah, being able to value your time and your resource is actually such a big part of that, because ultimately any project is contingent on how much time and money you can spend on it. In terms of like people, as a theatre maker, I'm quite lucky because it's a much more communal sort of practice than, let's say, like writing a novel or making a podcast. I have, direct collaborators or regular collaborators that I can always come back to and reach out to if I need advice, if I don't want to do some of these steps alone, because doing all these steps alone is also the draining thing, right? Yeah, often directors or producers I've worked with, those are sort of my key collaborators historically.
And what are the different ways that you've gained revenue through your work?
Well, this is the thing, right? In theatre, you very rarely make money from the box office. That's not really how it works. Actually, the necessity of resourced productions is kind of imperative if you want to make money. Otherwise, it is just a training ground. Like a lot of the time, most theatre makers are subsidizing their lifestyles as creatives with other like paid work to make shows. In terms of like revenue from theatre, like the only like passive income I ever occasionally get is from like my plays being licensed, which happens, very, very rarely. Otherwise, I'm being contracted to do a job for a theatre company. That's often how the revenue is generated, is like someone else is contracting me into their project. Because if you have to make revenue just from your projects alone, that is going back to the funding thing. You really have to be like making projects and creating a product that you can kind of like turn around over and over again. Yeah, it's not the most economically viable industry, and it's not one I would recommend anyone get into as their sole source of income. But it's one that has sort of skills that are really invaluable and can help access other income streams if that is the goal in mind, like being a theatre maker does make you a better arts administrator as well, because that is about putting on a live event with very little resource and knowing the kind of inner workings of that. And I think, some of our best arts administrators are people who have been able to be on the producing side as well as the producing the theatre side, as well as the crunching the numbers and funding apps and budgets and finding the kind of like harmony between those two seemingly disparate things. Ultimately, if you want to make money doing it, you have to know how to do the admin, and it's such a boring answer because you need to be able to know how to actually like budget and ensure that you're not making a loss, and knowing where to get that money from a funding lens, because otherwise you will be doing it in kind a lot of the time otherwise. Yeah.
Just finally, as a creative, do you experience, I know you mentioned it before, moments of self-doubt or imposter syndrome? And if so, how do you motivate and reassure yourself to keep going?
In terms of that, I think imposter syndrome is like a necessary ego check for a lot of people, in terms of it actually helps us stay active and trying. And I think sometimes we're really hard on feeling that way, but actually like embracing the feeling of imposter syndrome in all its sort of silver linings, it does keep us sort of dexterous and questioning the work. And I think like embracing it for its benefits, and embracing it for like doubt is a mechanism to make us like edit, and doubt is a mechanism to make us really think deeply about the work. Because in a way, like, I think if you really love what you do, the questioning of like, is this good enough, is actually a really important thing, because that will ultimately serve the work. I think when maybe imposter syndrome and doubt becomes somewhat kind of destabilizing, anxiety inducing, and paralyzing, that's something that does need to be managed. And again, your peers, your colleagues are the best people to do that. If you're working alone, that's like developing that circle again is like really, really significant. Like people who you trust to be honest with your work, right? Because the remedy to imposter syndrome isn't to be blindly ignorant to the work being always perfect. Like actually, I think that is a surefire recipe to like eventual self-destruction, because then you think that your work has to be perfect, and then you think that your work is perfect and that everyone has to treat it that way. But actually maintaining a level of like humbleness and gratitude to the art form is actually so important, and knowing that it's like a beast and something you have to wrestle with. There is something quite elusive about being a creative practitioner, that you just have to trust in the process. In terms of, I suppose, how self-doubt and imposter syndrome in the long term, what I'm trying to say is it will never go away, but I think you learn to understand that it's part of the process. Um, hmm. I mean, in some ways, the reason I'm wanting to go return to some sort of like higher education around the thing is because you can always learn more and you can always be better. And in some ways, that's like a painful like truth to have to acknowledge. It's like, how long is a piece of string? It was very much like, how do I become like the perfect practitioner? And you can't really. You can become athletic and you can become kind of like very like well honed in your craft, but ultimately there are things that they kind of have to maintain a sort of mysteriousness anyway, because otherwise, if we knew that we could do it perfectly, in some ways that wouldn't be very interesting. So, yeah.
Some great advice there, Nathan. Thank you so much for all that information. I think that'll be awesome for people to listen to and
Thank you.
find a few new skills. So thank you so
Yeah.
much for your time
Okay.
today.
Thanks, Sasha.